朗教授的这一个系列的演讲配合我们国际汉学专班的课程然后有一系列的这个内容那在这一个内容里面，他安排了3场的这个演讲那今天是第1场，探讨这个语文学的演变它的范围、概念、功能跟这个全球化。那接下来大家注意我们晚上上的这个公告的这个时间他接下去第2个场次会谈在易经中的语文学的这个新诠释，以及第3场会谈《论语》的全球研究，在欧洲语言中的《论语》的译本跟注释这是整个朗教授的一个非常完整的这个系列。那欢迎大家有兴趣的话，可以来这个参与这一个演讲。好，那我们这个演讲的第1场，我们请到哲学系的马凯之老师来这个担任主持人。那我接下来就把时间交给他来主持，谢谢。
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Lin. Good morning, everybody. 大家早安哈。这个我是马凯之这个哲学系的老师，我就简单用英文介绍一下今天这个Lackner 朗教授的这个第1场演讲。So my name is Kai Marshall, and I'm a professor in the philosophy department. And Professor Lin already introduced Professor Lackner in Chinese. So I won't do this again, at least not comprehensively. So let me maybe just say 3 things here. So first, Professor Lackner has a very long-standing interest in the relation between European culture and otherness. So China became a very important topic in your research interest very early. So you were a student of Professor Wolfgang Bauer. Wolfgang Bauer, I think many of you don't know Professor Bauer, but at least in the German sinological community, he's a really mythical figure, very important. Wolfgang Bauer has many disciples, and Professor Lackner studied with him in Munich. And the second point about Professor Lackner, second important thing to know is that he started early to have an interest in alternative rationalities. So dreams and divination in the Chinese culture became an important topic, I think, already in your dissertation, so very early on in your 20s. And then you also translated a very important Neo-Confucian philosopher into German, Zhangzai. Also, at least in the German context, Professor Lackner's translation of the Zhengmeng, the book Zhengmeng, The Correction of Useful Ignorance, is very important and still today often quoted. And then my third point, maybe more philosophical. So this connection between thought and history is very intriguing even today, especially in a global time, our global times. And as you all know, in the 19th century, German philologists made an important contribution to this question, or this problematique. So how does thought relate to history? How does thought relate to culture? You might think of philosophers like Hegel and Humboldt, but also Nietzsche, Burckhardt, Löwit, and many others who all explored this connection between history and thought, and language and thought, culture and thought. So this is a very German tradition. And Professor Lackner now, with his large research project in Erlangen-Nuremberg about divination and philology, esotericism and philology, makes a new contribution to this very old question. So today, in the first section, or the first presentation, Professor Michael Lackner is titled "The Evolution of Philology: Its Scope, Concepts, Functions, and Globalization." So I think you will revise the history of philology. Again, a very German discipline, but which has become very global today. And there are quite a few philologists and historians among us today. So I'm very happy to see you here now to readdress this very old topic. The floor is yours, Professor Lackner.
Michael. Thank you. 非常感谢这2位教授的介绍，过奖，真的。那我就开始。尊敬的林教授，尊敬的周教授，尊敬的马教授 ，liebe Herr Kollege，各位同仁， 各位同学，早上好。我很荣幸能够担任罗家伦国际汉学讲座第5届客座讲座教授这一职位。我是第5位获得这一殊荣的人，深感责任重大，也希望自己不辜负这一荣誉所承载的希望。我在贵校访问期间，这个研究主题是语文学与神秘主义 （Philology and Esotericism）。您或许会问，这2个研究领域有何关联？乍看之下，他们似乎毫无关系。语文学 （Philology） 是一门学术，其核心目标是对文本的理解 （understanding texts），而神秘主义 （esotericism） 则是由各种世界观和事件构成的混合体。此外，在某些情况下，神秘主义甚至表现出一种反科学的倾向，尤其是对严格意义上的自然科学持批判态度。当然，语文学的研究方法可以用于分析具有神秘传统的文本，但我们却从未听说过神秘主义的语文学，这是好像想不到的。然而，我建议从一个我们都熟悉的角度来看待这2个主题，那就是全球化。语文学在其发展过程中，仅有2个较晚兴起的分支实现了全球化，就是说，语言学 （linguistics） 形式语言学 （formal linguistics） 以及从解释学、阐释学 （hermeneutics） 演变而来的文学批评 （literary criticism）。但在接下来的讲座中，我都不会涉及这2个分支。与语文学相比，神秘主义的定义更加难以界定。一般而言，它的定义取决于观察者的视角 ，depends on the perspective。宗教、政治和科学的正统观念往往会排斥那些不属于自身体系的内容。同时，神秘主义有时也会自我定义，认为自己的另类，自己是一个另类的，不属于主流。定义的问题变得更加复杂，因为这2个术语，就是说语文学和神秘主义，特别是后者，在非欧洲语言都难以准确翻译。我们如今正经历着神秘主义的全球化，例如西方占星术 （astrology） 传入东方，而东亚的风水则在西方社会得到越来越广泛的传播。但我认为这2个研究领域不仅仅是在全球化进程中相互交融，更具有从一开始就带有某些 全球性特征的本质，特性的本质，这是第二个角度。在接下来的几周里，我想深入探讨这两个领域，就是说全球化的进程以及其固有的全球性特征。So I switch to English with your permission. Now my topic through the entire teaching career at your university has been globalization. It seems that this is not a new topic. Since the 1990s, a significant part of the social sciences has been intensely dedicated to questions of globalization. And I quote from Wikipedia, with your permission, "The process of increasing interdependence and integration among the economies, markets, societies, and cultures worldwide. While globalization is primarily an economic process of interaction and integration, it is also closely linked to social and cultural dynamics." So this article from Wikipedia, which I just quoted, emphasizes first and foremost the economic aspect, namely the exchange of goods through international trade. So much for the content. And secondly, it follows a perspective that locates the origins of globalization almost exclusively in the West, citing examples such as McDonald's and the singer Shakira, who, as far as I can see, only sings songs in Spanish, her native language, and English. So what about globalization, by the way? So in this enthusiasm for the topic of globalization, research has also attempted to identify historical phenomena that are supposed to be similar, such as in the past, such as the discovery of the New World at the beginning of the early European modern period, and even ancient cultures. However, as I quote again from Wikipedia, I quote, "Without the spread of traditional ideas from the East, Western globalization would not have emerged the way it did. The interactions of states were not on a global scale, and most often were confined to Asia, North Africa, the Middle East, and certain parts of Europe. Yet no details or examples are provided, and it remains a mere lip service. In the cultural sphere, however, one could certainly argue that K-pop from Korea and Japanese anime films represent a movement from east to west. There are three rivals," and I quote now from François Julien, who is a French philosopher who has some relations to China. Frankly speaking, I don't like each of his works, but here I think it's an appropriate quotation. So we have this idea of globalization versus global characteristics, which I also already mentioned in my Chinese introduction. And now he says, there are three rivals: the universal, the uniform, and the common. These are easily conflated, but we must also strip each of its attendant equivocality. It's the rigorous sort of universality to which science owns its power, which imposes logical necessity on natural phenomena and mathematics on physics, applicable to behavior as well. Is it equally pertinent in the domain of ethics? The notion of the uniform is in itself equivocal. One might believe it the accomplishment and realization of the universal, but it is in fact the universal's reverse, or I would say its perversion. He's very critical, as you can see. For the uniform derives not from reason like the universal, but from production. It is merely standard and stereotype. It proceeds not from necessity, but from convenience. And here you see, I mean, and I will abbreviate this quotation, the uniform is after all cheaper to produce because we see commodities, only them, because they have come to saturate the landscape. We are tempted to ascribe to these uniform things the legitimacy of the universal. So remember the universal, the common, and the standardization, so to speak. Ways of life, objects and goods, discourse and opinion are becoming uniform all around the planet. This is the uniform which he criticizes. Through the explosion in technology and media, but this does not make them universal. Now, at this point, I would like to establish an important premise. Globalization is a process indicated by the suffix "ization." However, long before this process began, we can observe a global character. This is the, which I just 全球化性的特征. A global character in certain human practices, what one might call an anthropological constant. I refer to this as globality, which is not my invention, but which is, I think, a nice word that corresponds to what I want to express here. So before any exchange or history of encounters can take place, there must be independent resources that exist beyond their worldwide dissemination. And I already said, regarding that second point of these lectures, these 研讨班, 下午的研讨班, esotericism, I will not say too much here, but it's far more difficult to assess let me say, the spread of esotericism. So in this talk, I will mostly talk about the global character, the globality of philological practices. For example, I mean, just to go back to esotericism, magic, divination, traditional healing practices are deeply embedded in the everyday lives of many societies worldwide. Whether as I said in Chinese, whether a religious, political, or a scientific orthodoxy treats a phenomenon as esoteric and possibly also marginalizes it, depends entirely on the perspective of the observer. Therefore, we must use the term esotericism. This is this afternoon's seminar in the sense of a global characteristic with great caution. But I will, however, elaborate on this further. Philology has, as you can see here, global characteristics, but its globalization has limits. Language, national traditions, etc. And we have few examples for globalization of philology, which started, as many of you know, somewhere, I mean, early modern philology. We will come to this, which started with Lorenzo Valla and later on. So we have, of course, India, which follows the example of, we say, English philology or Anglo-Saxon philology and hermeneutical literary criticism. But philology is basically defined by the expression how to make sense of texts. 文本的理解. Philology deals with texts. Linguistics deals with language. And in spite of overlaps, both are essentially different. And I quote from Professor Zhang Guming here, today's scholars and students in West and East Asia have all accepted the definition of linguistics proposed by Saussure and internalized by Zhao Yuanren. over the 20th century, linguistics indeed grew independent of philology to become a successful science, globalized science. Philology as a discipline, on the other hand, has declined. And I want to make a case here for philology in the traditional sense. Now, a global philology can be identified by comparison. By the way, one of the first examples of globalization of philology and linguistics, perhaps, is the Marshallentung, which follows the rules of the Latin grammar, but is the first explicit grammar to explain sort of the construction, the syntax, the rules of the Chinese language. Ma came from a Jesuit school, as you know, and was trained by the Jesuits. Now, what follows now is 4 examples where the twain can meet. So, 4 examples for a possible global character of philology, and I have some Western models in mind and some of the Chinese-speaking world. So with your permission, I don't speak about India, I don't speak about the Arab countries because I'm not a specialist in these, but these are offers that could be extended, possibly, to other philologies, languages. And it's not additive, as many of our books have been, and I have also contributed to books that, you know, talk about, okay, how was philology in India, how was philology in traditional China, how was philology in the German-speaking world, etc., etc. Now, this time I try to give you an offer precisely to compare philological practices. And we will hopefully discover that there are a lot of comparison or of comparable practices. The choice was determined by searching for family resemblances, according to the philosopher Wittgenstein, and I will elaborate on Wittgenstein this afternoon, because I think for identifying certain practices, a similarity is not enough, or the idea of a simile is not enough, is not sufficient. It's rather Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblances, of which I'm a great fan, I have to say, and I'm really, during the last years, I became more and more inspired by this idea, and I will talk about that during the afternoon. So let me just start this by giving you a first example from the West. Lorenzo Valla, who lived 1407, 57, and Lorenzo Valla's most famous and enduring contribution is his critical examination of the so-called Donation of Constantine, a document purportedly granting extensive or temporal authority to the Pope over the Western Roman Empire. And there is a treatise for which he became most famous. In fact, he wrote other treatises and books, of course, but this is called On the False and Forged Donation of Constantine. De falso credita et ementita Constantini donatione declamatio. And Valla applied rigorous philological analysis to expose the document as a medieval forgery, perhaps an early medieval forgery. So his examples, I will just name a few of them, show or demonstrate quite clearly that this document that really granted, as I say here, extensive temporal authority to the Pope, and which also helped to establish the church state, which existed until 1865 in Italy. Well, his findings demonstrated that the Latin used in the document could not have been written during Constantine's time, but rather reflected the linguistic style of a much later period. And what did he, how did he proceed, so to speak? This father of early modern European philology, you could say. First of all, he analyzed words. This is a philological business, in fact, analyzing expressions and words. For instance, the word satrap, which has a Persian origin, has never been used in ancient Rome. So at Constantine's time, this was a word that was inconceivable. You could not conceive of the use of that word. Second, he demonstrated that the Christian religion was not, at the time of this so-called Constantine document, was not yet a state religion. That came much later in 380 by Theodosius. So, in fact, as a matter of fact, that was a historical proof. And he added lots of other proofs just to give evidence for the fact that this was a fake. So, we have philology also as a historical discipline, as a discipline that reconstructs a sort of history, how they really lived, so to speak. This is called the higher criticism, die höhere Kritik. Combining, so, philological analysis, words, expressions, that style also, question of style. This donation here was composed in a rather crude style, which an emperor of the Roman Empire could never have used. And this is what he clearly demonstrates in this treatise. Very nice and very, very convincingly. And now you may ask, what were the consequences of this treatise? No. First of all, there were no consequences because the church resisted, of course, and said again, his work was a kind of forgery and fake. And, of course, the church state, as I said, persisted until 1865 when the Italian Risorgimento, the revolution, took over and destroyed finally and deleted the church state. But think of humanism. Think of the Renaissance, the 文艺复兴时代. Think of these repercussions of Lorenzo Valla's demonstrations, and they are incredible. So Lorenzo Valla inspired the humanists, first of all. He inspired even Luther and his Reformation, because finally, I mean, you know, the claim that the Pope had been installed by an emperor, Constantine, was a fake. So this is something the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, could use against the Catholic Church and, of course, the claims of the Pope. So there were consequences, clear consequences of this treatise. And in the long run, of course, the Enlightenment also came back or recurred on this treatise and said, okay, another proof for, you know, the superstitious character of the Catholic Church. So that is an achievement, you could say, and quite an interesting achievement, because in the long run it worked and it had its consequences. Now, doubt. Doubt is a philological device, very interesting thing. Lorenzo Valla doubted the consonant intonation. And you have much earlier, you have Ouyang-xiu in his Tongzi-wen, a boy's question on the I Ching. I mean, that's a tentative translation. And what did he do? He expressed his skepticism on the claim that, on the widespread claim, I mean, practically everybody at his time accepted that Confucius authored the commentaries, the Shiyi, the 10 Wings, by questioning the historical reliability of this attribution. That was absolutely accepted in the Confucian tradition. And I strongly recommend to read this Yi Tongwen, because of the fact that, of course, this is not only about style, this is also about the examination essay, the Baguwen, against which he expressed his doubts. Because, in fact, if you really want to get back to Confucius' teachings, this is the Baguwen, I mean, the examination essay is regarded or is considered to be a distortion. So Ouyang emphasized this distinction between the original hexagram text and which still he attributed first the hexagrams to Fuxi, then the hexagram text to Wen Wang, and then the Yaozi, the line commentaries to Zhou Gong. But he said, all the commentaries were a later interpretation which represented a later philosophical elaboration. Just as Lorenzo Valla said, this must be much later than the claim. So doubt, this is a very brief example. We will go much deeper, delve much deeper into other details. But here I would say one of the principles is huaiyi, is doubt. Because you constitute a text, okay, you are facing a text, and then you say, okay, I look at the words. One of Ouyang-xiu's question was, how come the Han dynasty never mentions these 10 wings? How come in the Zhuozhuan there's no mention of the 10 wings, etc., etc.? So he goes very far, both again in a historical and philological sense. And philology enables us to know something more about history. And it enriches our knowledge about history. This is what was called the higher criticism. First of all, we doubt. And then first of all, yes, we doubt. Then second, we analyze. We go to the text. We look at the words, at the expressions. And then third, we think, what about the past? What about the tradition? Has the tradition ever mentioned a given text? No, it hasn't. And then, of course, also, again, just like Lorenzo Valla, he asked for the use of certain vocabulary. So certain words in the as we the Xizhuan, for instance, is something philosophical. Okay, it gives a philosophical shape to a divination book, a book on divination, right? So, and the Shuogua equally, and Xugua, etc., etc. All these commentaries have some less, have a kind of philosophical background, which the Zhou-Yi doesn't have, in my view, at least, and in Ouyang-xiu's view too. So Ouyang-xiu denied this because of the occurrence of certain expressions. You can date a text by a philological analysis, right? And of course you can also date it by looking at other sources that mentions this text. And if there's no mention of this text, okay, we still can sort of believe that some of these sources have disappeared, etc., etc. But if none of these sources, of the extant sources, mentions this, then excuse me, then we are lost. We are completely lost. So this is so doubt, I think, is a very, very important tenet, so to speak, a very important element in philology. And this does not have anything to do with, you know, later literary criticism or linguistics. Linguistics work with language, which is okay. I mean, and I hold the okay, no, thank you. Okay. I hold linguistics in high esteem, no doubt about that. I was bored with linguistics when I was 20 years old, and later on, okay, I became more respectful for linguistics. But still, linguistics work with language. Famous dictum of Noam Chomsky: take any language, say English. So you see there's a certain bias, perhaps also a personal bias. But that has been globalized, as Professor Zhang has pointed out in a book which he edited, and where I had the honor to contribute a text, a short paper. Anyhow, the second example, I hope this is readable. Yeah, it's still readable, I hope, is style. And here I chose metaphor. Always, you know, under the aspect of comparability of two philological practices. We first had doubt, which is a philological practice, and you have seen, or I have tried to show the way of analysis in the I Tongzuwen, as well as in the treatise by Lorenzo Valla, and they are comparable. So an in-depth study should, of course, work on the methods, and they would find, of course, differences. I mean, the Chinese tradition is not the Italian or European tradition. There were differences, but at the same time, there is a family resemblance in these practices. So everybody knows, okay, this is Aristotle in the rhetoric, and he has worked on metaphors also in different contexts and in different works, but I just chose this one. Using a general term to refer to a specific case. For instance, if you say the ship is a vehicle, then this is already a kind of metaphor, from general, generic even meaning to a special meaning. Then reversed idea, from species to genus, using a specific term to refer to a general concept, referring to a cutting tool, any cutting tool, as a knife. So from species to species, you can say a storming sea is a raging sky. So you have, we will go into this via through a Chinese example, much more in detail. And of course by analogy. Analogy is one of the key elements of metaphors. Whereas a strict theory, if you apply Aristotle's strict theory to metaphor, you could never say A is like B. So just A, B, yeah. So this is the main difference. But okay, we don't care, because modern theories of on metaphor accept also these equivalences. A is like B, or A seems to be like B, etc., etc. So, analogy, a captain is the helmsman of a ship. A leader is the helmsman of a state. And we will find this almost exactly the same wording in Chinese text. So, again, still continuing Aristotle, giving the thing a name that belongs to something else. Okay? And of course, Aristotle admonishes us that the metaphors should be appropriate to the subject and context, neither too grand nor too trivial. This is a question of style, of beauty, of aesthetics, of course. Rhetorics, in his sense, have something to do, vital, to do with beauty, with aesthetics. They should be novel but not overly obscure. We will see other examples in a moment. They must strike a balance between familiarity and surprise. Again, a question of style, as you see. Question of style. And they create good metaphors, effective metaphors, create vivid imagery, engaging the audience's senses and emotions. So, persuasive tools that clarify arguments, evoke emotions, and enhance eloquence. They make speeches more vivid and memorable, aiding in the persuasion of an audience. So this is mind about rhetorics. So look at the Athenian state or polis. I mean, everything is open. An orator is a praised person. It's forensic rhetoric. On the Roman Forum afterwards, you have speakers, you know, who have who make their discourses in an oral way. This is much less the case for traditional China. We have conserved in the Zhuozhuan, but also in the Guoyu, we have certain speeches, so to speak. But later on, no famous statesman in traditional China was famous as an orator. So rhetorics did not really play, I mean, in the Aristotelian sense, did not really play a role. You could say Sun Zhongshan was a great orator, but that's late, rather late. So, I mean, if you look at his speeches, he was an orator. He was able to compose a speech, you know, and persuade the masses or the audience, etc., etc. But before, no, we don't have like the governor of Basra, for instance, you know, in Iraq, in present-day Iraq, who addresses the populace by a grand speech, you infidels, what, etc., etc. Inconceivable in China, in my view. Give me other examples or better examples and persuade me, but I'm still convinced that this is not the way. But still, you have a kind of rhetoric in the written way. In the written way. Erasmus, okay, this, we could skip that, but still remind that Erasmus also has 2 or 3 treatises on metaphors. A short similitude contracted into one word, or an impudent one. You can call a crafty man a fox. You can call a stubborn man a mule, or an impudent one a dog. Kind of analogy. And again, I mean, Erasmus was a writer, but he was more a writer than an orator. And Aristotle was thinking about forensic rhetoric, right? A proverb is like a chengyu, almost, carries a metaphor within it. It clothes truth in a garment that makes it easier to recognize. It has the power to teach by making the unfamiliar familiar, to paint in words what reason alone might leave obscure. That is Erasmus of Rotterdam, who was a great humanist, 15th and 16th century. Now, very short, and I apologize for the bad quality of this Chinese text, but I will give you more details just right after. This is Zhengxue, 1170, who wrote a book which is called The Rules of Writing, Wenze. And that book has been studied by people who are interested in, let me say, Chinese philology, if I may say, but very few still. And especially no comparison has ever been made, has ever been undertaken between, let me say, Western rhetoric, not to speak about India, and this guy here. And it's full of advices how to write in a beautiful style. It's full of rules, pre-rules. We will come to syntax right after this example, but it's full of rules. And okay, so he says, 比喻实法. There are 10 ways of a metaphor. Okay, I mean, metaphor is not the same thing. Aristotle's metaphor is not the same thing as 比喻. 比 is 比较的比, so you have a comparison already. Okay, Aristotle also talks about comparison, of course, no doubt about that. But here, modern Chinese has 隐喻 as metaphor, which is just one part of, or which renders one part of a metaphor. We'll see that in a moment. So there's no exact equivalence between both definitions or both elaborations of a metaphor. Call it comparison, but that's not enough. Call it analogy, but that's not enough. So he starts here with 一之有象以经其义，实之有比以杂其情，文之作也，可无喻乎? Is it possible to write without using metaphors? And here he just has not 比喻, just 喻. After closely studying the uses of metaphors in the classics, this is still the Wenze by Zhengxue. In the classics and their commentaries, I conclude that they use some 10 major types of metaphor. 10. And this is, much later on, in 1536, I think, a certain Xu Yantai wrote a book, compiled a book, big like that, large, which is called Yulin, the Forest of Metaphors. And that's a great book, and I'm studying that at the moment, so I won't tell you much about that book. It's just sort of in my hands. And I try to classify these thousands of what he calls metaphor, comparison, Vergleich, whatever. Thousands. And of course, not all of them would really correspond either to Aristotle, that's okay, but neither to this Zhengxue, to this Wenze. But let's have a look. Let's take a look at his definition of metaphors. So the first, 比喻实法. The first is the explicit. Excuse me for this translation. I mean, part of this translation come from a colleague called Kirkpatrick, but I couldn't accept all of his translations. I'm very sorry. So I retranslated a part of his sort of ideas. And really, I mean, the Wenze is a source, is a grand source, a great source for studying the way a traditional Chinese thinker thought about his language. I mean, thinking about language is not a given thing. Not even in cultures or writing cultures. We know, for instance, that from some missionaries' relations, some missionaries' narratives, we know that the Inca used Nahuatl as a language, and we don't know much about that, but we know that they had schools for beautiful speech. That's all. So even they, without any writing culture, had a kind of training, you see, a kind of training in this field. So the first, get back to Chenghui, the first is the explicit or direct metaphor, 至语. This uses a variety of like words and is explicit. 或言有,或言若,或言如,或言思. 或然可见. And then he sometimes, no, always gives examples for this. What is a 至语? Like climbing a tree to catch a fish. 求鱼也, 有. And here what he is interested in is the 有, like, as. And the analects say, like the North Star, analects is 论语, 比如北辰. And Chuangzi says the same thing. 四 is the important word. So he gives 比如, 有, 四. And he could also have mentioned 相. 相似的相. But he doesn't. I don't know why. He should have, in my view. We should have added 相 as this kind of, equivalence which he established. So this is in Aristotle's sense, and I just, the small comment below is my comment, so to speak, according to what Aristotle would have said about this definition. So this is a simile metaphor, a comparison using like or as. So Aristotle says a comparison is a type of metaphor, not the other way around, which aligns with this insight. So I would say this could be found, or Aristotle would have quite agreed with this kind of definition. Now, we don't care about Aristotle, but what I just wanted to show you is that there are overlaps, there are possibilities to compare, regardless of the differences. I mean, we have to take into account the differences between the differences between different cultures and traditions. That's interesting, but at the same time, we also can look for the commonalities. And the commonalities, this is what the Jesuits, when they came to China, did. I mean, they first looked for the commonalities and then for the differences, unlike later missionaries. They said, oh, the Chinese, they have academies like we do, they have a bureaucracy like we have. Ours is much, much worse. Theirs is much better, etc., etc. But they look for the commonalities, the overlaps, the points of encounter. The second is what is nowadays used as metaphor, or for rendering metaphor in modern Chinese, 隐喻. So this is what he called implicit or hidden, which is acceptable, I think. Although the language may be obscure, the meaning still can be deduced. 其文随回，义则可循. The Book of Rites says, that's an interesting, 诸侯不下于色, which is an interesting comparison. So a duke or twofold, whatever, an aristocrat. And this is the Li Ji, a quotation from the Li Ji, the Book of Rights. Must not marry a common girl. What is the implicit thing here, which we can deduce? It's User. So the translation is bad because it's User is not a common girl, but this is what he means. What is meant in the text of the Li Ji. So Aristotle, what I said, this is an implicit metaphor. This is why I translated that yin as implicit or hidden. The listener must infer the comparison independently. Very good. Absolutely acceptable, following Western standards. But this is not my purpose, of course. The third is the associated metaphor, 类语. This is constructed by selecting the same types of things, and linking them together to make a metaphor. 取其一类而次喻之. And then there are quotations, which is interesting. Jia Yi is a Han Times scholar. He says, 钱字如汤, 群臣如鳖, 中书如地. First of all, you have a hierarchy, right? I mean, it starts with the 钱字, and so on and so forth. And whole, terrace, earth are all words of the same type, he says. This is lei. This is what, in the following at least, in the tradition of Aristotle, we would say this is an extended metaphor within a single semantic domain, a kind of what Aristotle called, this is the Latin translation, of course, metaphora continua. So we have this hierarchy, but they all remain in the same semantic domain, which is come on. Okay. Yeah, thank you. No. The Lord. Third, yes. Okay. So think about it. Okay, matched, no. Fourth, 结语. Although this looks like a metaphor, it appears to be a question or a rhetorical question. 所谓语文思成劫难. For example, the Zhuojuan says people build walls to shelter from evil people. The walls were breached and torn down. Whose fault was this? And 谁之咎也? So this is something I have to confess. It's difficult to come to grips with what he has in mind. I thought, again, it's a single metaphor with a single semantic domain, metaphora continua, but I'm not sure about this. The whole text tells us something about, the idea that once the walls were breached and torn down, someone is guilty. Who is guilty? Whose fault is it? 谁之咎也? okay, we can perhaps, I mean, this needs more study in my view. I still don't really come to grips. It is perhaps the idea that someone has, in the state, of course, in the government, has committed a mistake. And that is sort of, or the analogy for that is the wall that has been built to shelter from evil people. So that is perhaps whose mistake is this? So there is a kind of analogy between evil people and the torn down walls or breached walls. But this is something we still have, I at least still have to think about it in more detail. So the fifth one is okay. I mean, this is something we easily can understand. And Aristotle would have liked it, again, matched 对语, two items to be compared and matched so that they fit together well. 贤必后正. For example, Zhuangzi says, the fish forget one another in the rivers and lakes, and men forget one another in the arts of the way. 鱼相忘，虎江湖；人相忘，虎道术. So you have a kind of proportional analogy. For term A, B, 鱼江湖, and 人道术. Okay, A, B, C, D. A, B equals C, D. It's a proportional, a four-term metaphor in the Aristotelian sense. You could also say there are two analogies once again. It's, so it works with analogies, on the basis of analogies. The sixth is the multi-metaphor. You would say multi or extended or whatnot, a metaphor. This uses several points of comparison, not just one. 取以为喻，不一而足. Xunzi says, like using fingers to measure the water in river, like using a long spear to husk grain, like using a cone to pick up food. But on the other hand, you could also say this is 类喻. So you have overlaps, of course. Like in Aristotle and like in Erasmus of Rotterdam, you have this kind of overlaps. This could also easily be called a 类喻, you know, adding one after the other. Amplification, as I said here, through accumulation of comparisons, multiple comparisons on the same subject. But that was also one of the definitions of 类喻. Remember, an in-depth study would try to understand, I don't do this here, but an in-depth study would try to understand where for him, I mean for the author, where the differences, the exact differences between a 类喻 and a 博喻. That would be an interesting point, I think, to study. We don't see here, let me just get back to this one, the 类喻. We don't see a hierarchy. Perhaps what he had in mind was a hierarchy for the 类喻. You have 天资, 群臣, 中术. But he doesn't speak about a hierarchy here. He just enumerates that or mentions that, but he doesn't say it's a hierarchy. So it's the same types of things and linking them together to make a metaphor. And here, again, it's, I mean, almost the same type of things. Fingers, spear, a cone. The seventh one is the reduced metaphor, which is called 监语. he says, 其文虽略，其意神明. The language is sketchy, 略, but the meaning of the metaphor is clear. So the 左传 says, 明德之语也, or 人斋也. This is the true metaphor because he doesn't use 比 or 相 or 思 or 有 or 如. He just uses a, b, 也. You see that? 明德之语也，人斋也. In Aristotle's sense, this could be what he calls a catachresis, a strained or forced metaphor. Strained means that you really have to come to grips with this comparison again. A good reputation is we would have to add something like is like, but no, a good reputation is a carriage for virtue. Benevolence is a boat, 人斋也. This is the true metaphor, so to speak, which does not need any word expressing a comparison. Eighth one is the extended metaphor. Okay. Although many words and sentences are needed, the meaning of the metaphor is clear. Then comes a long story. Because there is a story to be told. So, I mean, this is not, this is only my interpretation. First of all, it's a kind of metaphora continua, which we already had, bum, 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 one after the other, but also an allegorical sense. We haven't spoken about allegories yet, which play a big role, or great role, an important role in the metaphor theory, allegory. There might be an allegory. An allegory is something everybody knows, but which can be used, you know, in a certain sense and in a new sense. So a metaphor must be something novel, according to Aristotle. You haven't heard about that. But once everybody knows it, like a chengxue, for instance, then it is an allegory. It can be used as something that sort of is based on your erudition, on your knowledge, on your cultural and traditional knowledge. And then everybody understands it, but you can use it in different ways. It's not novel again. So once a metaphor has been coined, it can be afterwards transformed into an allegory. But still, this again needs more study. An extended metaphor that functions as an allegory. You know, this Chan, Wu Zai Ming Qi Huo, Qian Qi Shu Er Yi, Huo Bu Ming, etc., etc. Wu Yi, Ren, Jin Ren, Renju. You know, the Renju is the ruler. So many of these examples have something to do with Zheng, with politics, or the government, or the bon gouverne, or good government in a certain sense. Okay. The ninth is the quotation metaphor. This is absolutely easy now. Here the words of predecessors are quoted to prove something. This is also something he 以证启示. For instance, the George one says, 有所谓言而从熏夫言者也. Or again, a young ant learns that by ceaselessly carrying earth. But look at all the things we have to add in the translation, which are not there. I mean, we have to add that in order to make that understandable for us. But, of course, it's a quotation. These are metaphors that provide evidence that certain things can only be achieved after ceaseless effort, with a cited source. Is this still a metaphor in our sense, or in a modern sense? What does it contribute to a theory, the logic of metaphor? Now, the 10th one is the abstract metaphor, the void metaphor, so to speak, 虚喻. In these, there is no reference to concrete reality or actual events. Like 不知物亦不知事. For instance, the Lunyu says, Confucius, when passing by the ruler's throne, spoke in a humble and self-effacing way. 其言实不足也，不足者. And Lao Tzu says, 漂习, well, he quotes the wrong, I mean, his quotation is wrong. The Lao Tzu says that was what you can find in brackets. Abstract metaphor means also a paradoxical metaphor. It's not evident what you compare here. It appears sometimes self-contradictory. But at the same time, this 虚 also evokes an atmosphere, a kind of intuition. It's more about the soul than about the mind, I would say. So this might be the 虚. He just gives these examples, but we would have to look in other books. For instance, the Yulin I just quoted. Now, very brief. Yeah. Traditional China did not have an explicit grammar. Every language has a grammar, but an explicit grammar came with, as I just mentioned, the Marshall Wentong. And of course, we have grammars written by missionaries, Franciscans, Jesuits, etc., etc. And the most famous is the Notitiae Linguae Sinicae by Joseph de Prémat, which is a good grammar, by the way. But still, traditional China did not have an explicit grammar, that is to say, a handbook, a textbook of how, to write and to write properly. What is a grammar? A grammar means, the syntax, for instance. What is a main clause? What is a subordinate clause? What is a relative sentence, etc., etc. So that did not exist. Whereas in the West, there are people who say the grammar of the Greek language, the ancient Greek language, even was before the Greek language emerged, okay, just to overstate the sentence. Then you have in India, you have the famous Panini, who centuries BCE, wrote a grammar. The rules, not the Wenzhou, the Wenzhou is very close to that, but the rules of language, the rules of how to formulate, articulate sentences. What are the rules? And the West had books, lots of books, grammars of ancient grammars of Greek, of Latin, and then later on of the vernacular languages. By the way, quite late, we will see that in a moment. And I just want to go through an exception. Usually you have grammar or syntax formulated in words, in sentences, what is, as I said, the main clause, what is a second clause, what is a subordinate clause, etc., relative sentence, and so on. This is a diagram, in fact, on Sheng Tuoma Aquina, on Thomas Aquinas, ens reale, the real actual being. I mean, we don't make any effort to decipher that. But I tried, and somebody else tried. And that is very interesting because here, comes back. Must be there in a moment, yes. You know who translated this into Chinese? You remember the first one was from left to right. So you have this is called stemmatic, you know, like a tree, arborescent structure. So you have the ens reale, which is on the left, and then all the qualities that are related to the ens reale, the real being. There's a treatise by Thomas Aquinas, a very early treatise, by the way, one of his earliest treatises about this question. So this is more or less written for didactic purposes, okay? Here people have to learn how this is structured. And Matteo Ricci, Li Mato, in his Tianzhu had the same thing but in another structure. So it starts from top to bottom. But he apparently was well acquainted with this diagram. But that met with a tradition, a Chinese tradition, very favorable to this kind of diagrammatic representation. And we will shortly go through this. Yes, we still have 15 minutes and then question and answers. Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. So, a certain Wang Bo was a student of Huang Gan, who was the son-in-law of Zhu Xi. Okay, so you have the line. Who composed Yanji Tu, a diagram on all diagrams on the classics. Basically, it is not the Wu Jing but the Sizhu, and here you have the Zhongyong, and you can see very clearly an order, and we will just go through this order just to amuse you, to entertain you, to give you some moments of entertainment, how this is structured. And I anticipate now, my thesis is, my idea is that you don't have an explicit grammar written in words in traditional China, but you have it in a visual way. So this gives you an idea on Wang Bo's, and okay, he is in the line of Zhu Xi's Dao Tong, of Zhu Xi's, the Chengdu school of how to structure a text. This gives you its textual analysis. And at the same time, it's grammar, it's syntax. So we go through this. I mean, this is a translation which you don't need in English, but we will get to this. Now, look how it starts. You see, 大在圣人之道. Okay, this is the main clause. And then what comes is yang yang hu. Subordinate clause. Sends forth, nourishes all things. We will just go through that so that you can see how this is constructed, and very clearly Junji Yu Tian rises up to the height of heaven, etc., etc. So, on the other hand, you have a second subordinate clause. You see, on the left. Syntax, grammar, very simple. Their understanding, which is not, which does not completely, which is not completely in accordance with a modern understanding of grammar. I have not presented, I didn't have the opportunity to present this to Noam Chomsky, and I won't, definitely. But here you have sometimes, you have a sort of the kind of, this chart and many, many other diagrams could show you lots of these diagrams until the Ming, early Ming. Then they died out more or less. They were no longer in use. Used for didactic purposes, pedagogical purposes. A teacher would normally, draw. The first one, the first famous diagram is Zhu Xi's Ren Shuo Tu, where he sort of illustrated his own text, with a diagram, just to make clear how this has to be read. So, and sometimes semantic, what we would call semantic, and syntactic aspects overlap. So, okay, that's the Chinese way. So we can't sort of measure that up to the yardstick of a general grammar. Okay, now you see. Li Sanbai, the 300 rules of ceremony, this is how the text goes, we can just... And of course, Wei Yi San Qian, this... I hope you still have the text in mind, but it gives you here, this is almost the entire text, except for one, Dai Qi Ren or Hou Xing, that is not in the text. That is not in the diagram, that is in the text only. And we will go through it, you see, and completes. What is subordinated? What is important? What comes first? What comes second? What comes last? Where are the relations between the different parts, the different elements of the whole text? And this is what the diagram achieves, basically. So, again, coming back to what I said before, no explicit grammar needed. We have pictures, we have visualizations, but they fulfill the same purpose as a formulated grammar of Latin. Of course, on the other hand, and what is interesting here, and what you can clearly see, is parallelism. This is all inherited from the Pianti when, of course, this is the model. And Chinese language is a parallelistic language, so to speak. So you need parallels. You see a parallel in every Duilian and everywhere. In many, many poems and texts and so on. So what you see here also is parallelism enacted, embodied. But still, this is how this text works. Look, we just go very briefly through that, because I have something else still in mind. Another parallel or another family resemblance. You see, okay, I did that with a lot of effort, but then you can see how, slowly, all these elements come together, and then we have the parallel things, and of course the subordinate parts of the sentence. Okay. So now I have constructed, or I have tried to show you the construction, and I think it's quite convincing that here you have, like the Wenzer, not in written form but in visualized form, you have certain rules. There's a famous a diagram on the Ximing, the Western inscription by jingxue, which is also works the same in the same way. That is to say, topic, comment, topic, comment, topic, comment, thema, rema. There has been a long debate over the question whether even modern Chinese is a subject-predicate-oriented language or a topic-comment-oriented language. I would opt for topic and comment, looking at these things. Okay, last thing here, punctuation. Punctuation is very important to constitute a text. We have a long history of punctuation in the West, and we have a long history of not punctuation but dividing sentences with breaks, with ruptures, breaks, which is called, and also in Han, already in Han times you find the expression judo. Judo. So that marks, apparently, a break when you have to stop. And then second, the commentary also gives you an indication of where to stop. Here, stop here, I will explain this word. Stop here, I will explain the sentence, etc., or the meaning of the sentence even. Okay, now Zheng Duanli, again, in the school of, in the sort of Daotung of Zhuxi, was a great man, and his program is really worth studying. Has not been studied very much so far as I know. I mean, there are some, and certainly not in the way of comparison, definitely not. Now, you have the Chinese text on the left, and what, I mean, you could say he overstated that, but, but still, I mean, you can see that. I mean, I can just read it. He has a 3dian, and he has a 中dian for pauses. So he gives sentence, and then pauses. And then in the case of personal names, geographical terms, as well as short sentences within long sentences, these are combined using successive medial dots. And he has a long list of colors even, red dots, black dots, half black dots, half red dots, etc., just for, you know, I mean, for making a text readable and sure. So this is a help, of course. Again, didactic, like the diagrams before. Didactic that enables students to understand or to better read or to better come to grips with the text. Now look here. This is Hong Dongzhu, etc. He said here, 上方言而下正. Previously, something was expressed indirectly. In the following, it will be expressed directly. Previously, so this is also syntax. No, without diagrams, without visualization, but it's syntax. So, red lateral stroke. You can see that here in the Chinese text. This is the edition from Siku Quanshu, but I had older editions, but they are not so easily readable. Red dot, black stroke, stroke dot, color red, color black, etc., etc. Then you know the text by heart, I would say. This is of course also following a kind of 朱子读书法, you know, the kind of how to read books. Very interesting also for our understanding of, or for our understanding of their understanding of a text. It's philology, again. Example, 大学之道, you all know this. Then he says, when the meaning of the written text needs to be separated, it is structured into a sentence. This is what he says. 入 on the left here 入大学之道才明明的文艺短为句 So he defines what is a sentence, and he defines what is a pause, and so on and so forth. So this is that. Now, again, so he identifies particles, I mean, 虚字, 实字, 者, 也, correspond to the speaking pauses, etc., etc. And he goes very far. But the texts are always the siju, the 4 books, because this was the thing, I mean, which all the students in the Changzhou tradition had to learn. Okay. Yeah. So give me 1 more minute. So it's not only about punctuation and dots and so on, but also about the definition of a sentence and a clause, and direct and indirect expression, which is also very interesting. Let us see here. No? 下有成上字为斗, not do, but do. In this case, okay. So, just to end this, much later than Chengduanli, we have William Bullockar, who wrote a short introduction or guide to print, write, and read English speech, 1580, very late. And Bullockar is the first in English language. I don't talk about Latin, Greek, and that's a long story to be told, the history of punctuation, which is so vital for philology, right? So Bullockar describes specific punctuation marks, such as a period, a comma, a colon, parentheses, question mark. The first who explains this, hundreds of centuries after Chengduanli, okay, that you have a concise explanation of these punctuation marks. Not before. No one had thought about this in as far as I know, in any Western language when we come to early modern times. And just to give you a last impression, I mean, you know, remember Chengduanli, how readable this is, also for you and for all of us. And now, look at this. You would have real difficulties. I mean, this is 1580, and it needs a specialist to decipher these characters. This is English. This is the original, by the way. And you see on the right side, you see clearly the comma, the colon, the dot, and so on and so forth, and his definitions of that. But how difficult this is to read. So this was just to show you some possible points of comparison where we find something like a globality, a global character of philological practices, and where we find some overlaps or family resemblances in this case. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this wonderful talk. You mentioned a lot of very interesting questions, and also made us dive deeply into quite a few interesting Chinese texts. So, in particular, the last final really texts, Neo-Confucian texts, were really interesting. So I'm certain there will be questions and comments in the audience. So we have about 15 minutes. So please do not hesitate and just raise your hand if you have a question or a comment or any other thing to say for Professor Lackner. In Chinese or in English? Yeah, we can. Yeah, please. First question for you, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for Professor Lackner. I have a question about Chen Kui. My question is that, does Chen Kui just record the metaphor he meet?
Yes.
Or he really made some evaluation between these metaphors? For example, he thinks some metaphor is good for writings, for speech. Some use of metaphor is not so good, not so well to use in writing and to use in speech. It's my question.
That's a good question. No, I don't think he makes any judgments. I mean, this is the only part in the whole Wenzel when he speaks about metaphors, or let's call it metaphors or comparisons, and he doesn't make any judgment. He just enumerates. You could say, okay, for us sometimes it's difficult to grasp the idea of the difference between a leiyu and a boyu, for instance. But and that would be our problem. I mean, we would have to think about that. But he doesn't. Whereas in Aristotle and even in Erasmus later on, you find judgments. You find, oh no, don't use this kind of. No, because I mean, the Chen Kui as well as Cheng Duanli, they were Chen Kui even more than Cheng Duanli. They were very learned people. I mean, they quote in the Wenzel, you find quotations practically from a great bunch of a great variety of sources, just to not only for the metaphors but also for other problems of, let me say, yeah, we would say grammar, but it's not style, let's say. No, but very good question, yeah.
Who else wants to say something? Any other question or comment? Yeah, please.
Hello, Professor Lackner. Well, from your talk today, I think the major point in your talk today is philology. And by philology, you mean the way people deal with text. So you gave us several examples for comparison. So we can see I think it's not only similarity, but also family resemblance.
Yeah.
Although you didn't elaborate why, how it is different from mere similarity, because I'm not an expert in Wittgenstein, so I look forward that you can explain more in the future that why the examples you gave us, the relationship between them is more than similarity, and why you will think that it reflects Wittgenstein's idea of family resemblance. And but the theme of your series, the series of your talks, is not only philology but also esotericism. And so, as you also mentioned at the very beginning, to combine these two things might raise some skepticism, because there's one tradition in esotericism or mysticism which claims that language is the barrier for grasping the true essence or the supreme truth. And the Zhuangzi certainly is the very famous representative of that kind of idea. And I'm not very sure about the Western tradition of mysticism. I only know some names like Meister Eckhart. So for those kind of doubt about whether language would be the barrier for understanding to grasp the supreme truth, how will you react to that? And also, I think probably in religion, some mystical religious figures, they also think faith is more important than reason, and reason is connected with language. So that is my
Thank you. Thank you. Now that's a good question too. Now the program has, up one part philology and one part esotericism. And today, this was just a kind of introduction why I have to or will sort of talk about these two topics. And I will talk about them, or I want to talk about them, from the point of view of sort of globalization and global character or globality. But to come to the core of your question, yes, indeed, there's a lot of skepticism in many texts, and even in many practices of present-day and traditional esotericism. Okay, but this is a bit like, the Chan Yulu, they were the religion of silence, but they talked and talked and talked, and they filled whole libraries with their talks in the Yulu. So the collected sayings of the Chan monks. So again, same thing for esotericism. Sometimes, yes, they preach silence, but in order to preach silence, you must talk a lot. That's a paradoxical problem with esotericism, and in fact, we have. Well, as I said before, or in the introduction, we can use philological methods to analyze traditional texts. Like Meister Eckhart, for instance, whom you quoted, and it's interesting because Meister Eckhart wrote in two languages, in Middle German, and in Latin, of course. So, and you can compare these texts, and that's a very interesting job, by the way. You can sort of find that he said something in Latin which he would never have used in the German version, and vice versa. So this is another topic. I will sort of try this afternoon in the seminar. I will try to give a first overview on this kind of really difficult question of whether the word just esotericism can be applied beyond the West. Because we have, you have Mi Jiao, for instance, which comes from Buddhism. You have Shen Mi Xue, which is a rather modern, but which also renders mysticism, occultism, and so on. And then you have Ling Zhi, Gnosticism or Gnostic knowledge, etc. Many, or a good deal of translations. But whether, this is something I really want to elaborate during the afternoons. To find out a possible sort of, like I did for philology, something like not only the globalization, which is a matter of fact. This is a matter, of course, we can see it everywhere. As I said, feng shui goes to the West, astrology goes to the East, but what are the intrinsic characteristics of something we could call esoteric or esotericism? That is in my mind, and this is my job this afternoon to start with that. But thank you, yeah.
Is there any other comment or a question? Or maybe then I can just make two remarks, or two questions. So first, esotericism. So I would love to hear more, like Professor Zhang, about your views of esotericism, and so in particular, to give a specific example, these diagrams, like Zhu diagram on humanists, I think they also had the purpose to guide people to meditate. So to acquire direct, immediate insight into totality or into the Tao. What do you think of this, or this point? Would you?
Yes. No, there are 一目了然 or 言不尽意 or, all these expressions around the 图表, the diagrams. And of course many of them, most of them in the Chengdu school line, Daotong line, they were meant as didactic tools. I mean, just to, as you say, to introduce you into the text, but they have also something prescriptive. That means, why did they die out, or why weren't they practiced beyond the Yuan time? In early Ming, you still have that, but then afterwards, because they perhaps were too prescriptive. People didn't want to have this guidance. People just wanted to read their own way. So that is my hypothesis, because all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but more or less, the height was, the peak was Sung Yuan, and then it sort of disappears. But you also have sort of mystical diagrams that, for instance, that I don't have that here, but that constitute a character on its own. For instance, Zhong, the center, is constituted by characters, and finally you read, this must be the center, and all these characters from the Zhongyong, the Lunyu, the Daxue, they circle around, and that's, you could call, that's revelation. I mean, so the viewer or the beholder is called up for a kind of revelation. Boom! It's what these sentences, all these sentences mean. Zhong, or Jing, also Zunjing the Jing. Very, very interesting. So you have the double character, revelation, but also guidance, or yes, as you said, didactic tools. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, this is very interesting. So, maybe a second question. Yes. So the global historian Michael Lackner has argued that statistically speaking or pragmatically speaking, it is easier to revise or even to question a text in a culture without a God, omniscient, omnipotent God like in Europe. Mm-hmm. So because in Europe you have the authority of the text is directly linked to this idea of the existence of an omniscient, omnipotent God. Yeah. So in East Asia we do not have this idea, or we didn't have it in most among the cultural elites, or to a lesser extent it wasn't really there. So what do you think of this comparative claim? I mean, 有道理. There is some reason to it, I think. So even, in religious life, you don't have a dogmatic final authority like the Pope or the even the Protestant Council or something like that. You don't have that either neither in popular religion, nor in Buddhism, not even in Taoism, right? Yes, and that is, of course, the proliferance of the different schools, and of course there are fights and controversies between different schools, no doubt about that. But there's no one finally to decide. It's up to you to decide sort of which school sort of you give more credit. Yes, okay, and then we can ask, what about the authority of text? And here I would say, for a long time, these texts, I mean the Neo-Confucian texts to which you have more authority than many texts, for instance, of the Taozang. Okay, you have, of course, the Laozi, which is an authoritative text, and for some people also the Zhuangzi, and even the Lizi. But basically there is no authority that says this is a credo. You have, I mean, in the Christian credo you have 10 articles. If you don't believe one, you cannot be called a Christian any longer. But you don't need to believe that Lao Tzu ever existed in order to be, to be sort of faithful to Taoism.
Don't you think so? I mean, that would be my tentative answer.
Thank you. Yes, yes, yes. I think you're right here on this point. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I think we probably need to will continue all these questions in the afternoon session.
Yes.
So I don't see any other hand raised, or is there? No. So we probably should stop here. It's noon, and everybody will go to lunch now. So thanks again, Michael, for this wonderful talk, and let's give him a warm hand.
Thank you.